Brilliant. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Rory and James podcast. I'm James,
And I'm Rory.
and you're Rory. And we've got an episode today, which is not the one we originally advertised for. We are currently working on our new song release we're going to do, but we're doing this podcast over the internet, and actually that song episode we're going to do is actually going to be together. So we're still, and when I say together, I mean in person. So we're still working on it. But for now, we thought we'd bring an episode just to keep the punters happy, as it were. And Rory, it's a subject that you had raised as something of a topic for podcasts, and it's to do with dancing disability. So we wanted from the outset, if you just wanted to sort of give us an idea of sort of why this was something you wanted to sort of discuss in the podcast.
Well, I just had I just had some very general ideas about disability and dance, and as I say, in general terms, it is uh, we, we our podcasts are of course designed to just put some thoughts in the mix rather than anything definitive. So anything you want to add to what we're going to say, or you can also do in the comments, which you're very welcome to do. No, it was just really that I, although I appreciated dance when I was at college as a wheelchair user, it's hard to describe. But I also associated dance with movement of the entire body as well as the hands and the feet and everything else. And I just wanted to have a look at that from a disability point of view and a general point of view within this podcast. Really, have you been involved with dance, James?
I have to admit, I do very little dancing. I think it's just as well because I'm no good at it. So I
Mm.
think that's for everyone's benefit that I've never really been that involved in dance. But is it something you've always been interested in, or is this like a relatively new interest that's come along?
I suppose fairly new in the last few years. I mean, I did it at school and at college myself. It's I remember although I was interested in the choreography of dance, I also it wasn't a restriction, but you had to move very specifically and very coordinatedly in order to make a good performance. And versus the freedom of dancing at a disco, I'm actually moving as I'm talking to get into the spirit of it really. And it was because I can't walk, it sort of subconsciously was the only art form that reminded me of disability, even though people put forward the effort of including disability in dance, if that makes sense. And I just thought it would be an interesting topic. Um, Folding that into disability though, um, I I once had a situation where I was helping out with a charity in London. I once, and I went. They asked me to help with one of their wheelchairs, and the lady wasn't particularly informative about disability. I'm not. I don't mean that rudely. I'm just saying that as a general thing. And I sort of said, well, um, I won't in this case try out your chair because you're not, you know, because you wouldn't ask an able-bodied person to try out your wheelchair. You're just asking disabled people to try it out. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
it was quite difficult to. It was just making that more of a universal thing, really. But but going back to dance, I really appreciate the choreography, but there's also a restrictive aspect to it, I think, as well. Um,
Yeah, that's fair enough. And then in terms, because obviously listeners will know as well as myself that obviously you're very much into music. And was there any link between sort of your love of music and sort of interest in dance, or are they sort of two separate things in your sort of interests?
yes and no, really. It depends if you're watching it visually or whether it's an audio aspect. But when I would watch dance on TV, I'd see people feet dancing and sort of moving very freely and without being restricted. Which, if you're in a wheelchair, of course, you are restricted. So again, subconsciously, I was reminded of my restriction. And in fact, I wouldn't mind speaking today as another chance to do dance and disability. In the disability realm, though, if you were talking about disability in a sort of presented way, quite often on Britain's Got Talent, for example, a disabled person would talk about comedy around disability. One I heard recently was a disabled comedian came on to Britain's Got Talent and said, "Do you know what? I can't stand," and then said, "No, let me re-emphasize. I can't stand." You see, so it was always around that theme. Does that make sense? So if I if I as a wheelchair user was going on stage and saying, you know, I go on stage and start a comedian act by saying I broke the tap in the kitchen broke yesterday, something totally different from disability because that was so common as a subject for disabled people. So try and make that more rounded. And also you were asking me about music as well. When if you get a song that's performed live on stage sometimes, as you and I have done or whatever, a guitar lick is different, or a note is different, or a playing of a song is different, or a flute is different because it's what happens spontaneously on stage. If you have to follow choreography on stage, you are restricted. Although some choreography is beautiful and can look perfect. So again, we're coming back round to the concept of both sides to the argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Definitely. Yeah. And it's an interesting point you make about the comedy stuff. Is it that you almost feel like some comedians who are disabled are restricted to their comedy to just have their disability as their theme and can't just do general comedy that, like they said, like their disability almost restricts them even in the sense of comedy, which isn't directly relevant to their disability, for example. Was that, have I kind of summarised that as somewhat?
They're not restricted to it, but it is commonplace to them. It depends how politically involved they are with what's going on. Because if you didn't have any political aspects to your comedy or your conversation or your life, and you were disabled, we wouldn't have ramps on buses, we wouldn't have ramps into cinemas, and so on and so on and so on. Although it's become so commonplace that it is an aspect of disabled comedy and disabled culture that it can be overemphasized. I'm not saying that's entirely negative. I'm just saying we come back to this balance aspect. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and do you have a vision, for example? What is your vision for making dancing more accessible to people? I mean, is it? I'm thinking of something like Strictly Come Dancing. British show that's really popular, and obviously it features dance heavily in it.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do you have visions of something like that being more inclusive, or is that tokenistic, or what's your take on what you'd like to see sort of in the wider public to make
I'm not sure because as a visual comprehension, I haven't seen as much of it as maybe I'd like to see. I'd like to see how people would just like to translate what they believe into it in a positive way. I was working with a guy called David Toole, who sadly died now, but he was involved with the Olympics, and he was an amputee. So I've seen lots and lots of positive things come from disabled dance as well. It's just one of those things that I wish I could do, is to get up and use my full body as an expression of dance. But that's just me. It's not, David Toole or whichever other dancer we're speaking of might have a different attitude to it, But I would certainly like to see what they would bring into dance and disability in the future. But maybe that could be a subject for a future podcast that I'd only know the answers to then, as it were,
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So, were there any final closing thoughts you wanted to share, or anything arising from what we've discussed in this?
Well, if anybody can think about where I could go to see more disabled dance or more integrated dance, I suppose I prefer generally discos or unchoreographed dance. But if you can think of the alternative, let me know. That's what I would say. What about you, James?
Yeah, no, I think it's all fascinating. I think I think a lot of what you say is really interesting about this stuff, and there's a lot that can be done. Whether it's in local dance studios or TV and stuff like that. I think to make things more inclusive and promote sort of this, dance more widely in the community. I think it's a big discussion, really,
Yeah,
definitely.
I remember I once went into to look for a local dance class, and even the here we come full circle. Even the building itself that the dance was in, that wasn't accessible to start with, so I couldn't get the wheelchair in to use it. So if
Right.
it's bringing those two bits together. Incidentally, as regards training, just quickly as well, I know that people tend to, or people on training days at my schools and disability schools, they talk, they train, they talk to disabled people, they learn certain things, as I've done. I've learned from lots from disabled people myself and able-bodied people. Again, I'm trying to bring this as rounded a view as I can, but when they're training, they didn't. I don't think they actually spent the day sitting in wheelchairs or, or trying to use walking frames or trying to replicate physically those experiences that disabled people might come across. But as it happens, maybe you and I should go to a dance performance and give our reflections afterwards. Who knows?
Sounds like a good idea for a new podcast.
Absolutely. There we are. Well,
Brilliant.
that's one for the future, and we will be back in the future. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to hear your additional opinions, listeners. Thank you.
Yes, the email's up on the screen. You can email us or put something in the comments. We read all our emails and comments. So yeah, do get in touch with us. Love to hear your views on it. And for now, we'll call that a day. And hopefully, be back with a musical podcast for the next one.
That sounds good. See you next time. Thank you. Bye.